Welcome to another episode of the Battlefields Bourbon Podcast, where we sit and sip, talk all things Civil War history and bourbon whiskey. I'm Jack, joined as always by my co-host Elijah, and we're joined by a special guest today, but we'll talk about him in a second. He is here with us. I'm excited for this episode, but I'm going to let Elijah take us straight into the bourbon for this one.
Yes, we've got Colonel E.H. Taylor Small Batch from Buffalo Trace Distillery. This is one of their harder to find expressions. This one is bottled at 100 proof. Being bottled in bond would mean that it's made by one distiller at the same distillery in a single distilling season, bottled at 100 proof, and aged at a minimum of 4 years. This is just like a federal quality assurance when it comes to the world of whiskey and bourbon. That Bottled in Bond Act itself was passed back in 1897, back when bootleggers and proprietors and others were kind of passing off whatever they could as whiskey, whether it be kerosene or tar or what have you. All these other, not whiskey items are being passed off, and that's where this comes in with government quality, and that's just kind of stuck ever since to that day. So that's like a little piece that every distillery kind of does in terms of their own expressions. But this one, named after Colonel E.H. Taylor, he was one of the founders of the Old Fire Copper Distillery back in the 1870s, when Buffalo Trace was first getting its roots out in Frankfort, Kentucky. But yeah, this one is, like I said, 100 proof, 50% alcohol by volume, and we can go ahead and give this one a try. Yeah, that was a good pop too.
So I'll talk a little bit about our guest, because he's giving me looks. We are joined by the one and only Nicholas Picerno of fame in both history and collecting world. Nick's not a bourbon drinker, so the faces he's making as we're talking and looking at it is funny. Let's give it a little nosing. Nick, I'll describe to you what I think it smells like and tastes like.
Cherries.
Cherries.
Heavy on that one. Cherries and like baking spices.
Do you want to smell it, Nick? Smell it from the bottle.
It's got a nice sweet...
What does it smell like?
Cherries.
See? Exactly.
Yeah, there you go,
just
Nick.
put that thought on their mind. But yeah, no, it's a good one. It's a little younger than the single barrel that we had in another setting. But it's about, I think, 6 to 8 years, whereas the single barrel's in the 9 to 10 range. Allegedly, this one being a Buffalo Trace product, they don't disclose any of their mash bills or anything like that. They keep all their recipes top secret, just to keep that tradition, unique to them. So this one being mash bill number 1 is a low rye mash bill. They will tell you that much, but they don't tell you the ratios of the grains in this. But it does give a nice sweet, fruity kind of palate to it. But
yeah, it warms you up. I mean,
yeah, it's got a little heat to it.
A little bit of heat to it. Bottle. I like to review the bottles. I think it's a cool looking bottle. The box, what do you call it? The tube that it comes in. Mm-hmm. That's iconic for E.H. Taylor. But when I look at this bottle, I just think right away, like this is something that you would find in like a wagon during the war. The bottle shape alone, but then also the
label and everything.
The labels and everything.
It's got that classic old style look.
Yeah, the little sketch of, Taylor on the side. Very neat bottle.
On the tube itself, where it gives you kind of like the old 1800s style kind of drawings and stuff on it, and the it's not accidental, let the label tell the truth, all this other stuff. It's like those like kind of catchphrases that they used back in the day to kind of boast about the quality of their product, and that's kind of one of the things.
The snake oil style of
exactly.
Advertising.
It's very much what it is. But yeah, that's E.H. Taylor in a nutshell. Without further ado, Mr. Picerno.
Yeah. Let me tell a little bit more about Nick here.
Okay.
Nick's a good friend of mine. Known him for a number of years now. I don't know, probably 7, 8 years, something like that. Nick is served 40 plus years in law enforcement, right?
48.
48 years in law enforcement. Many of those years as chiefs of police for many departments. Last at Bridgewater College down in Bridgewater, Virginia. He has been on the board of trustees for the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation since 2003, 3. He's the chairman emeritus for the Battlefields Foundation. Do you hold any position currently?
I'm currently the vice chairman.
Vice chairman currently. You've served on boards like the Lee Jackson Education Foundation, the Museum of the Confederacy, and what other ones am I missing?
The Lincoln Society of Virginia.
You currently sit on that, correct?
I am the vice chairman of the Lincoln Society of Virginia, located in Harrisonburg.
Very nice. And Nick is a premier historian and collector when it comes to the topic of today's episode, and that is the 1st, 10th, and 29th Maine. You might be thinking, oh my gosh, 3 regiments in one episode. Well, the story of those 3 regiments is really told as one regiment per se, but we'll let Nick get a little bit more into that. But ever since I've known Nick, the words Maine have not come out of his mouth, unless it's been like, weeks without saying them. It's every 5 seconds, but for good reason. He led the fight for the placement of a Maine monument on the 3rd Winchester battlefield. And he's, like I said, a premier historian. If it's close to a battle anniversary where this regiment fought, no matter what year in the war, he's probably there close to that anniversary, and he can provide a ton of information. Had the honor of doing Antietam 160 a couple years ago with him, last year with him, and bringing some artifacts back to the battlefield. That's probably the most fun part of knowing Nick, is being able to be a part of those moments and see the looks on faces of individuals that get to experience that as well. So without further ado, Nick, I'm excited to hear it for probably the 100th time, but probably not all in one sitting for this. Normally I get a little bit of 1st Maine, a little bit of 10th Maine, a little bit of 29th Maine here and there. So for the enjoyment to watch Elijah and other listeners listen to the full history of the regiment, I'm excited. So if you want to take us to the beginning and if you want to tell us a little bit more about how you got into this regiment too, take it away.
Sure. Well, to begin with, before we get on to the regiment, I must say I'm impressed with your collective knowledge of bourbon and the processes to distill it and make it. It's been educational, and I'm really impressed with that.
Thank you.
About the regiment, the 1st Maine was the first regiment from the state of Maine to enlist at the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861. It was a three-month regiment. But when they arrived in Washington, D.C., many men of the regiment contracted the measles, so they never left for the seat of war. They stayed in D.C. Some of them went out souvenir hunting, and for instance, I have a piece of wallpaper that one member of the regiment took off the hotel where Colonel Ellsworth was killed. Another member took some pages out of a religious tract from a church in Alexandria. And others stayed in camp. I said they would deal with measles. And at the end of their 3 months, they went home. But many of the men that went home said, look, this war is still going on, because after First Manassas, everyone thought the war might end. It didn't. So many of the officers and enlisted men of the 1st Maine said, we need to see this out. So they formed another regiment, the 10th Maine, which was formed in the fall of 1861.
How many would you say made that transition?
Probably about half.
Okay.
Probably about half. And it was a 2-year regiment, and they mustered out in May of 1863, right during the Battle of Chancellorsville. Well, some of those same men got together again and said, look, we had Chancellorsville, Gettysburg. We fought with the 10th Maine at Cedar Mountain, at Antietam. We really need to see this out again. So they wanted to be named the 10th Maine Veteran Volunteer Infantry, but the governor of Maine would not consent to that. So they were given the designation of 29th Maine. They were formed in the fall of 1863. However, they were given a 3-year term. They fought in the Red River Campaign and here in the Shenandoah Valley of 1864. In May of 1865, they were at the Capitol Prison in Washington, where they guarded the Lincoln assassins. The war is over. They're ready to go home, but the government said, wait, you signed 3-year papers. You have another year to serve. But the war's over. Yes, but you have your obligation for another year. So they were sent to Darlington and Florence, South Carolina, where they administered the Freedmen's Bureau. And they dealt with former slaves and their former masters, dealing with contracts and civil law. And it was called the Eastern Military District of South Carolina. And many of the same regiments in the brigade were also sent with them to South Carolina, and they served there until June 21st, 1866. So effectively, the history of the 1st, 10th, and 29th Maine begins in April 1861 and does not conclude until June 1866. In 1871, the prolific regimental historian John Meade Gould is finishing his regimental history to talk about their service, their national service.
What year is this?
1871.
Wow, so not too long after he's starting to compile.
He writes the regimental history that Rutherford B. Hayes actually wrote him a letter and said, this was the best, finest regimental history I've read. But when he has to title it, he titles it The History of the 1st, 10th, and 29th Maine. I don't believe there are any other regimental histories that have three numerical designations as they did, nor were there many regiments that served as long as they did when you look at their collective history.
Yeah.
So is this more or less the same regiment that just kind of keeps getting kicked to the back of the line when they re-enlist? They give them a new designation in terms of the number?
They do. As I mentioned earlier, they wanted to be called the 10th Maine Veteran Volunteer Infantry, but that wasn't going to work. As a matter of fact, I have a Corps badge that has that on it, but it's a 19th Corps badge. The 29th Maine was in the 19th Corps, but this one says 10th Maine Veteran Volunteer Infantry. They were in the 12th Corps at the time. But this particular soldier was anticipating going into the 19th Corps, bought a brand new Corps badge.
Wow.
He's in the 10th Maine Veteran Volunteers. Well, there's another aspect to their history where this soldier was involved. As I mentioned, the men of the 10th Maine signed up for 2 years. However, 3 companies signed up for 3. So when the 10th Maine went home in May of 1863, these men formed the 10th Maine Battalion. There was a couple hundred of them, and this particular soldier was in the 10th Maine Battalion, and they knew they were going to transfer right to the 29th in the early spring of 1864. And again, he thought they were still going to be in the 12th Corps. They weren't. They were in the 19th Corps. So therefore, there were men who in the 10th Maine who served at Chancellorsville and Gettysburg. As a matter of fact, there was one man lost at Chancellorsville. He was at the Chancellor House when a shell tore his foot off. And he would die a week later.
Wow.
At Gettysburg, they suffered no casualties. They were the provost guard for General Slocum's 12th Corps. He sent 6 men out on a scouting expedition one night, and they recorded what they saw. But that was pretty much the only time they actually saw gray-clad men in battle, other than the only ones they saw were the prisoners that they were guarding, as well as the hospitals along the Baltimore Pike.
Wow. So I guess let's backtrack to 61. Everyone's got measles and their enlistment's up. So come August of 61, you said about half re-enlist into the 10th Maine in August of 61.
It's roughly about half, maybe 40 to 50% of them re-enlist into the 10th Maine.
What is this crop of men from Maine? What do the ranks consist of, whether it's occupations or region of Maine?
It's a good question. Well, very few of them, if any, were professional soldiers. Of course, many were farmers, many were laborers, but Company D of the 10th Maine, which later went to the 10th Maine Battalion, was composed of English Army deserters from New Brunswick, Canada.
Wow.
They crossed over the border to get the larger bounty, and those who weren't English Army deserters in Company D, they were from Aroostook County, way up in the northern part of the state. They were lumbermen. John Gould once wrote that they were when he was talking about the English Army deserters, that they were a worthless lot, devoid of morals. And then the lumbermen had a difficult time becoming acclimated to the city boys, he called, those from Portland and the area around Portland, and there were even some men came from Massachusetts. But it was a cross-section. John Gould was a banker. Mm-hmm. He wrote the regimental history. The colonel of the regiment, the first colonel of the 1st Maine was Nathaniel Jackson. After the 1st Maine's term expires, he becomes the colonel of the 5th Maine. He's then replaced by George Lafayette Beale, who was a bookbinder. Would later become the adjutant general of the state of Maine under Joshua Chamberlain. They were close friends. And Beale stays in the 10th Maine for the entire term, is colonel of the 29th Maine until the summer of 1864 when he's promoted to brigadier general. The next commander is William Knowlton, who doesn't attain the rank of colonel. He's a major, but he's one of the men in the regiment, one of the officers who had some previous military experience in the Maine militia in Lewiston. Knowlton is given command of the regiment at the Battle of 3rd Winchester. The morning of the battle, he's telling a couple of his captains, Captains Whitmarsh and Turner, he said, "Gentlemen, do not be too absorbed with your own companies during this battle today, but I want you to look out for the entire regiment." And they looked at him sort of quizzical. "Why? Where are you going to be?" He said, "Gentlemen, I will die in this battle today." Well, they march on to the middle field, early afternoon of September 19th, 1864. They're encountering troops led by John B. Gordon, troops from Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana. I mean, fierce fighters, fierce. He's on his horse. He's directing his men to fire upon what they can't see the Confederate troops because they're in a gully, but they can see their flags. He says, "Gentlemen, fire at the flags. I know you can't see the men, but hopefully you will hit some. Fire at the flag." He's getting off his horse to talk with the Colonel Good of the 47th Pennsylvania, when either a shell or a bullet tears into his neck. He falls to the ground. He's taken to a mill near the battlefield where he will succumb to his wound the next morning. Now, I am sure even today, men and women who are on the battlefield, many may have a premonition of death. They're encountering, it's all about life and death on a battlefield. So I'm sure he was the only one who had a premonition of death on that battlefield that day. However, I also own his letters. And in all his letters he sends to his wife, Harriet, he signs them all, "Love, William," except the letter the day before the battle. That letter is the only letter signed, "Goodbye to all, love, William."
Wow.
So he had a premonition of his death. Well, when he dies, command is given to George H. Nye, who's also from Lewiston, Maine, who works in a textile mill. That was his only background, was working in a textile mill. And he would lead the regiment until the end of the war, until June of 1866.
And Nye he had company command, correct?
He did.
Before this?
He was a captain of Company K. He was another prolific writer, and I have his letters, about 1,600 letters.
Wow.
And his wife Charlotte, who we referred to as Charlie, and his letters are very, very poignant. You know, "My dearest Charlie, my dear love Charlie." She would die in 1885, and it devastated him. And he would remarry after the turn of the century, and then he would pass away in 1908, and he's buried at Arlington Cemetery. But he wrote Charlie probably 2 or 3 times a day.
Wow.
Sometimes, because of the scarcity of letter writing paper, he would turn the letter upside down and write in the margins. So when you read his letters, you have to read them one way and turn the paper upside down. One letter that he wrote a letter in November of 1862, right after the Battle of Antietam. Now, they had lost their daughter, Georgie, earlier that year, Georgette. And he's writing to Charlie one evening, it's a Thursday evening, and he says, "My own darling Charlie, perhaps you may ask what has wrought such a change in me. Perhaps it's because I have seen so much of life and death, which led me to reason more than I hereto have done. I have seen the strong man in health and vigor of manhood stricken down in an instant. I've seen them die calmly and with a cheerful smile on their countenance on the battlefield, when the air was filled with deafening sounds of musketry and cannon, which was sweeping down the strong men by scores. No fears were in my heart. When I went to the fight at Antietam, I never expected to leave the field alive. None knew my thoughts but the one above. I thought about what our darling used to sing, pray on the field of battle. Captain Furbish, that's Nehemiah Furbish, was killed close to me. Some of his blood flew in my face and revolver. I wiped them both clean. To merely look back to see who else was killed, in a few seconds his lieutenant was killed. He was sitting on the fence right next to my side. Almost at the same instant, one of my men was killed, close behind me. The ball could not have passed more than an inch from me. The splinters were flying from the fences and trees, but I felt no fear. I knew not what the next bullet would send me to where our daughter Georgie dwelt. And why should I fear? She met death bravely, should not I? And death had no terrors for her. Why should they for me? She hoped to welcome me in the other hereafter. Do not I hope to welcome you? She died believing in a happy hereafter, and should not I? But why go on in this catechism? God in his infinite mercy saw fit to pass me through the fiery ordeal. For what good purpose the future can only tell. Perhaps I am yet destined to meet my death on the battlefield, but he alone knoweth. But if that is to be my fate, I hope I may die fearlessly, for I hate a coward. I have but once to die, and if I had 1,000 lives, I would give them all for my country. Nye really expressed his innermost feelings when he wrote to Charlie. And with the amount of letters that he did write, there are numerous instances of him showing the depth of his conscience and what he witnessed on battlefields. And we're fortunate that his letters survived, as well as all the letters Charlie wrote back to him. And at the end of every letter, he said, Charlie, I only received one letter from you this past 2 days.
Get it together.
I know. He was like, I mean, he probably received more letters from her than most soldiers received from their wives.
Yeah. So leading up to, like you said, I think you put it very well, that like what's on his conscience. And because you often you can see the picture of the soldier. You might be able to read a letter or two, but they're not going into detail like that. So to be able to kind of jump inside the mind of a soldier and what they're witnessing, and specifically his, him being able to relate what he's seeing on the fields around Antietam Creek near Sharpsburg, and relate those actions and heroic deeds of his, comrades to then the innocent death of his daughter. I think it's pretty eye-opening for folks. And I guess catch us up to September. So from August of 61 to September, what is the 10th Maine? Because this is probably their not first contact with.
Well, Antietam's not their first battle.
Yeah.
Their first sort of skirmish was here in Winchester during the retreat from Winchester upon Stonewall Jackson coming down into town in May of 1862. Mm-hmm. John Gould called it the Great Skedaddle, because they left town. They would actually, they were the last regiment to leave Winchester.
This is First Winchester, May 25th,
1862. They skedaddled all the way up to Williamsport, Maryland.
Oh, my goodness.
I have the letters written by the wife of the quartermaster, and she recorded that they were being shot at as they're retreating, not by the oncoming Confederate troops under Stonewall Jackson.
Citizens of Winchester.
Exactly.
Yep.
The citizens of Winchester from the second-story windows, mostly women. Women found revolvers and pistols and whatever else they had. They were shooting at them. So they retreat all the way to Williamsport. One man, Andrew Walton, I have his letters, decides to stop and rest somewhere near Bunker Hill in present-day West Virginia. He's there with another man who records what happens. As they're sitting on a log, through the dense tree line where they were sitting comes, and he calls him the Cavalier Ashby. Turner Ashby appears. He's on his horse with several other men. They see these two 10th Mainers sitting on the log. He says, surrender. Well, the one man who writes about it, his name was Maines, he surrenders. He said, I'm done, I surrender. But the other one, Andrew Walton, goes to grab his musket. Turner Ashby pulls his revolver out of his holster, aims it right between Andrew Walton's eyes, shoots and kills him.
Wow.
And I believe that revolver is on display at the Stonewall Jackson House Museum.
Wow.
So he's killed by Turner Ashby. We know he's killed by Turner Ashby.
So that's May.
That's May. It was May 26th.
The 5th.
25th when they leave.
Oh, that was on the 26th.
Right.
And then Turner Ashby had to go from May
Oh, he dies June 6th, 62.
Yeah, just down. They had to go.
So
up
they
the
aren't
valley
they aren't
to
a part of
Harrisonburg.
the pursuit of Jackson back up the valley.
No. No, they stay in Williamsport. From there, they go to Harper's Ferry. They stay with Banks.
Yeah.
They with Banks twice, and neither time are they with Banks that they really feel like they've been successful. They with Banks here, the Army of Virginia, Banks Army, when they're in Winchester.
Yeah.
When they're the 29th Maine, they with Banks in the Red River Campaign, when Banks got Porter's gunboat fleet stuck in the Red River. And the men of the 29th Maine and I believe it's the 96 USCT had to build a dam to raise the level of the water so they can float the gunboats back down the river. But that was another debacle that Nathaniel Prentice Banks was involved in. So,
Speaker of the House. Right?
Yeah, Speaker of the House,
Yeah.
Governor of Massachusetts, but he had great political backing.
Oh, yeah. Lincoln liked him, right?
Liked him,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
So summer of 62, where's the 10th Maine?
Well, before they fight at Antietam in August of 1862, they're near Culpeper,
Okay.
and they're engaged at the Battle of Cedar Mountain. That was a particularly tenuous situation. They were there because they're ordered to go out into a field to leave their cover behind and be the only regiment to advance by themselves. George Beale is horrified at the prospects of that. And
Is it a cornfield, a wheat field?
Near the wheat field. Well, he almost gets into a fist fight with the aide-de-camp for the commanding officer, a man by the name of Louis Paluzzi. And they're screaming on the battlefield. But Beale relents, and the men leave their cover. They're exposed. And the firing was so intense that one man wrote that when he took off his blanket from his knapsack, there were no two pieces of cloth that could stick together in the middle of the blanket.
Oh my gosh.
He said it was hailing bullets. Lost a lot of men there. They lost, their first officer, a man by the name of Andrew Cloudman. They later named a GAR post in Maine after him. But one man, Abiel Edwards. Abiel Edwards' letters still exist. They're in a book called Dear Friend Anna. Well, he wrote a letter to his sister, Marcia, that's not in the book. And in the letter, he wrote, Dear Marcia, you remember I spoke to you about that hat that was shot during the late battle at Cedar Mountain and Culpeper? Well, I cannot send you the entire hat, but I can send you the bullet hole. And here in front of me, I have the bullet hole from his cap, from his forage cap, that was left after the Battle of Cedar Mountain. Edwards served with George Nye in George Nye's Company K, and he was a faithful soldier. He had some lung problems, and he would actually die early. He would die in the 1870s in Massachusetts, and he's buried near Casco, Maine. But that's the bullet hole, and his letters have been published. What
are the casualties at Cedar Mountain for them?
They lose about 172 men. There are actually two monuments at 10th Maine in Culpeper. One's on the battlefield that John Gould and another man who's the color corporal, a man by the name of George Ayer, they have a monument to the regiment made and placed on the battlefield. They're there right around 1911, 1912. And there's another much larger regiment that lists the men who were killed, or some of them. And that large block, it's a granite block, is in the Culpeper National Cemetery. So when some people ask, well, can you tell me how to get to the monument of the 10th Maine at Cedar Mountain? I have to say, which one? And most of them believe there's one. But there's one on the battlefield right there where they had to leave that exposed position. As a matter of fact, there is a stereo view that was done by Timothy O'Sullivan of the 5 officers of the 10th Maine standing right near where the monument is.
That's the picture you'll see in the episode cover with the 5 guys standing there.
But he took a later photograph that I was able to discover and prove that they're also those same men. It's called Graves on the Battlefield. Those same men are further down that little hill, and they're looking at the graves of their former comrades who were left on the battlefield. And you see them all there.
Wow. So from Cedar Mountain, then we can get back to Antietam now. Set up, I guess, the 10th Maine in their action and kind of what Nye, as he's writing his letter to his wife, what is the 10th and what is Nye experiencing during the Battle of Antietam?
It was about 7:15 in the morning. They're coming down, it's known today as the Smoketown Road. They're coming from Keedysville area where the 12th Corps camped. Their Corps commander is Joseph King Fenno Mansfield, just appointed Corps commander 3 days before the battle.
How old is he?
He's in his 50s.
Oh.
One of his claims to fame prior to the Civil War was he had a leading role in the construction of Fort Pulaski in Georgia. Mexican War veteran, and he's given command. And they're approaching an area of the battlefield called the East Woods. In the woods, they're facing men from Georgia and Alabama and some from Texas. They're deployed along another fence line. Nye writes about that, and that some of the men are sitting on a fence. And they're being deployed there by Mansfield. When Mansfield orders them to stop firing because you're shooting at our own men, Mansfield thinks the Confederates in the woods are part of Hooker's First Corps on the way back after advancing, through the North Woods. One of the men, a sergeant by the name of Libby, said, "General, no, they're not. They're Rebs." Captain Jordan states the same thing. He said, "No, sir, those are Rebs." Mansfield turns, looks, and says, "My goodness, you're right." And then when he turns, Captain Jordan sees a red spot in Mansfield's white shirt. He'd been shot. They take him down from his horse, and they bring him to a depression just behind the East Woods, and the depression is still visible today. He's later taken to the Line Farm and would die the next morning.
So he realizes he's wrong as he's been hit.
That's right.
Wow.
That's right. And you remember I mentioned that they were taking souvenirs when they were in the 1st Maine? Well, they took souvenirs off his body as he.
Oh gosh.
George Nye gets his hat. Captain Jordan, who's with him,
The same guy that wrote the letter you read.
Same guy who wrote the letter gets.
So he's feeling all these emotions, but he's like, I think I'm going to take that with me.
I think so. Yeah.
He doesn't write that to his wife.
Well,
Grieving piece.
Captain Jordan gets the hat cord, and a man in Company F grabs his gauntlets. He later gives them to Captain Knowlton. Knowlton's not in Antietam; he's sick. But when Knowlton returns, he gets the gauntlets of General Mansfield.
They're just picking him apart.
Yeah. So later that year, George Nye sends Mansfield's family the hat.
So he gives it back.
Okay, that's respectable.
Well, not only he gives it back, he sends it back, but they send him a letter, and I have this letter in my collection. It says, "Thank you for returning the General's hat. He was a patriot, brave as can be, and a true representative man. Please accept and are enclosed a light cavalry saber of our manufacture." Well, that cavalry saber was made by the Mansfield and Lamb Sword Company. They were relatives of General Mansfield. They were located in Forestdale, Rhode Island. So he gets a sword for returning the hat.
Fair trade.
Well, yeah, and I had the letter, so I knew about the history of it. I also knew that the sword was on his casket before they lowered it down to his grave at Arlington. But I always wondered what happened to the sword. Well, about 30 years ago, I was contacted by a George Nye descendant, and they asked if they can see his letters and his diaries, because I have his diaries as well. I said, sure, if you come by and see him. Why don't you come in May? Because May is usually the time I leave New England. I was living in New England at the time. Why don't you come down then, and I'll give you a tour of the battlefields, because I go to Virginia during that month. And they said, sure. So they came by. And I gave them tours of all the places where George and I fought and served. I took them to the East Woods at Antietam, took them to Culpeper, took them to Relay, Maryland, and Harper's Ferry. And they said, they came to my house and they said, there's something here we want you to have. And they unrolled an army blanket, and in it was a light cavalry saber, a Mansfield and Lamb, dated 1863, engraved with George Nye's name on one side and all his battles on the other.
Wow. And they just gave that to you?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, we did a legal document to make it all
Yeah.
Well, of course, but
we
wow.
have a legal document. I think I paid him for it, but certainly it was a nominal fee.
But for something like that, I mean, that's
Yeah.
Well, they wanted to remain with the rest of his. I mean, I had the sword belt he carried it on.
really
And of course, I had the letter, and I had all his letters, his diaries, his insignia, his photographs.
it belongs together.
Yeah, all his company books. I acquired the Nye collection in 1986 at an auction. I'm sorry, I learned about it at an auction, and I bought it subsequent to the auction. And there's about 8,000 pieces in that collection: letters, books, orders, muster rolls, photographs, part of the regimental flag that was carried at 3rd Winchester. There's quite a bit.
Wow.
So they wanted to be returned to his buddies. And that's not the only time something like that happened. And right around 2007, 2008, I get a phone call from a family in Charlottesville. They knew of the president of Bridgewater College, Phil Stone, is a Lincoln scholar, very, very well-known and respected Abraham Lincoln scholar. They called him and asked if they can get an appraisal of a Lincoln photograph they had. It's a ferrotype. He said, well, I couldn't do it, but my police chief can. So they called me. And I said, I'll be delighted to. They said, well, do you have anything of Lincoln's? I said, I have a couple things. But I focus on the state of Maine during the Civil War. And the woman paused and she said, well, my husband's great-great-grandfather's brother was killed at Antietam. Well, then I paused because there were only 2 Maine regiments at Antietam that were actively involved, the 7th and the 10th. So our husband got on the phone. He said, I said, well, what was your ancestor's name? He said, his last name was Reed. I said, was his first name Asa? And there's a pause. Next thing you know, he said, how did you know that? I said, he was in George Nye's company. I had the letter George Nye wrote to Charlie describing his death. So I made a copy of it, brought it to their home in Charlottesville, gave it to him, and I did the appraisal on the Lincoln piece.
Mm-hmm.
And the gentleman said, I'll be back in just a second. He comes back with a photograph album, a Civil War period photograph album, a carte visite album. He said, I want you to have this because Asa belongs with his buddies. Again, he belongs with his buddies. Open it up, and there's a photograph of Asa Reed in his uniform with bayonet and holding a book. And he's wearing his VMM belt buckle,
Wow.
which stood for Volunteer Maine Militia, but John Gould said it stood really for Very Mean Men.
I heard that too, yeah.
And he gave it to me.
Wow.
And what are the chances that's going to happen? That's the only CV I've ever been given, carte visite I've ever been given in Virginia. It happens to be somebody from the regiment that I've been collecting for the last almost 50 years.
Now, I've got to ask, because I'm sure a bunch of people that are listening to this are going to want to know, what is your draw to this regiment among the many, many others that served during the war? What started your interest in collecting their stuff?
Sure, it's a good question. In the 1970s, a very close friend of mine, he's now deceased, was a well-known collector of Maine photographs and memorabilia. And he lived in Maine, he lived in the mountains of Maine, near the Canadian border. He acquired Colonel Beale's trunk and his uniform and some of Colonel Beale's items. And at the time, I was collecting anything identified, but I also had a focus on 3-inch artillery projectiles. So it was a diverse amount of collecting I had done then. But I realized I couldn't buy it all. So about 6 months after acquiring Beale's uniform and the trunk and such, I learned about the existence of Knowlton's uniform, his letters, his camp chair, his cartridge box, his sash, and some other items. And I acquired that, and I said, you know what, I'm just going to focus on the 1st 10th to 29th Maine. And there was a presentation store that a very well-known dealer had for sale, but it was about half a year's pay, and I couldn't afford it. But he had a photograph album that was a couple $100. I could afford that. And about 10 years ago, I found the sword again, and now I could afford it, and I added it to the collection.
Very nice.
It's a beautiful presentation sword for one of the captains in Company G.
Wow.
So that's how it started back in the mid-'70s.
Awesome. Love hearing that. Now, this was when you had mentioned it was Nye's sword.
Mm-hmm.
Do you display that with the sword belt?
Yeah, talk
Do you
about
have the snaps attached to the sword? Like, do you keep that together or separate?
I don't keep it with the belt. It's how I do have it displayed. It's displayed with the blade and with the scabbard separate.
Mm-hmm.
So people who see it can read what's on the blade. Because on one side
Nice.
it says George H. Nye and his rank.
Mm-hmm.
On the other side lists all the battles. And Nye writes about that. He had that done after the war. Shortly after the war, he had the blade acid etched with the battles and his name. Now, it's interesting. What's interesting about this sword is, in January of 1865, the Mansfield and Lamb Sword Company sends a letter to George Nye. I owned the letter. And it said, enclosed is a scabbard to replace the one that was damaged during the Battle of Cedar Creek. So we know...
They're taking good care of him now.
Well, we also know that sword was at Cedar Creek.
Mm-hmm.
And I've got a wonderful letter about what happened to him at Cedar Creek. He writes this letter on the same day as the battle.
So this is Nye?
This is Nye.
So he's in regimental command?
He's in command of the regiment at Cedar Creek.
The 29th Maine, Cedar Creek, a month later after Knowlton is killed.
Right.
Where are they at Cedar Creek?
Well, they're...
I know it's going to hurt to say it, but...
they're at where the quarry is now.
Yeah.
They're in where Nye and the regiment had the heat of the fighting is now a big ditch. It's a quarry. However, their first stand is still preserved. Where they had their first stand, that is preserved. And as they fall back, because they're being, the troops under Juberelli's troops are pretty much running them out of their camps, their 19th Corps camp. And their camp is at the end of the 19th Corps trench line. They're the last regiment on the 19th Corps trench line.
Going west, technically.
Going west across the railroad tracks. They're up on a little...
Which were not there at the time of the battle.
They were not. So they would camp there and they fall back.
Is that hill, you were going to say, going up the hill, is that hill a part of what we know as Red Hill when interpreting the battlefield?
That's a different part.
That's a little bit north of it.
That's right. It's a little north of it. So they have they're in their camp. They climb the hill, and Confederate troops are crossing Meadow Brook. That's that little brook that flows behind Belle Grove. Gould writes about that, and they have their first encounter there. They can say they can see Meadow Brook from their first stand, so it's right in the top of that hill where they can see
looking down.
Yeah, because they go further back.
Towards the quarry.
Towards the quarry, you wouldn't be able to see it. So we know that land's still preserved. Because you can't go further back now because the berm is there, and that berm prevents you from going back. But they had their first stand there. But Nye is wounded later on in an area called the Peach Orchard. And
where was this at?
Near the Shipley Farm, Bellevue, closer to where the quarry offices are.
Okay.
As they're going back, it's later on. And he writes from the camp of the 30th Maine because he goes there after he's wounded to get stitched up by the surgeon. And the colonel was a close friend of his, a man by the name of Hubbard. And stated, Winchester, Virginia, October 19th, 1864, Dear Charlie, you may be somewhat surprised at receiving a letter from me at this place, but strange things happen nowadays. So you must not be surprised, as we had a severe fight this morning. It commenced before sunrise. I cannot give you all the particulars of the fight now, but our regiment was engaged and suffered considerably. I received a rather severe wound for the time being, but it will not lay me up a great while, as I have just had my wound sewed up and dressed by the surgeon of the 30th Maine. I was struck by a minie ball on the right-hand side of my nose.
Oof.
It went through my upper lip, knocked out 2 of my upper teeth, striking my jaw heavily, and lodged in my mouth, from whence I took it, and it is now in my vest pocket. I lost my mustache, as they had to shave me in order to get at the wound.
Poor guy.
I was on horseback when I was shot, and I was the only one in the regiment that was mounted. I fell off when I was struck. I bled like a stuck hog. I think I must have bled all of a half a pint. I rode here from the field about 7 miles on horseback, and I found myself rather weak from the loss of blood.
Oh, jeez.
Now, George Nye, if you see a photograph of him, he had these huge mutton chops.
None of those are him.
No, none of those are him.
So none of those in the episode picture. We'll have to post a separate picture.
But in the collection, I have a photograph of him taken as a captain. Then I have a photograph of him taken when he lost his mutton chops.
Mm-hmm.
And then I have him as a colonel with the mutton chops. And then finally as a brevet brigadier general. Actually, he attains the rank of brevet major general.
Can you see the wounds after?
No, they're not that obvious.
Huh.
They're not that obvious.
Wow.
But
Do
he
you
was
have the
also
bullet?
wounded in the wrist at Cedar Mountain.
Do you have the bullet?
Yeah.
I wish I did.
I was about to say,
That
it
would
was
be a
like
cool
in
piece.
my vest pocket, and now it's here on the table.
Yeah, I would love to put it out here and say, here it is.
I know.
It would certainly be a marvelous thing to have, to show.
I'm sure it takes a couple generations, and one of the great grandkids or something's like, what's this random bullet? And, I'm sure Nye was determined that, the kid, at least his kids knew what that was or something. Or maybe he didn't. Maybe he got
Could've been
buried with
buried
it.
with it,
We'll
yeah.
never know.
Well, he kept his letters together. As a matter of fact, the letters originally came in a trunk.
Yeah.
And a collector in 1960 bought them from an antique shop in Massachusetts that dealt with removing facades and mantles from old homes.
Mm-hmm.
And he bought it, but he was a collector of envelopes, covers, and stamps. The letters were just there. So when I acquired the collection in 1980, I think it was 85 or 86, I contacted a genealogical association, and they contacted me a year later saying that one of their members saw a trunk belonging to George Nye in an antique shop in Massachusetts around 1980, 5 years ago. Well, I called every antique shop I could find in Massachusetts, and I got a hold of this fellow. He said, yes, that trunk was filled with letters, and some fellow bought them because he wanted the stamps in 1960. And I said, whatever happened to the trunk? Because I had everything that was in it.
Mm-hmm.
He said, I still have it in storage. Would you be interested in buying it? I said, sure, how much you want for it? He says, how's $100? Well, you never saw $100 come out of my pocket so quick. So the letters they're not in the trunk, of course, they're all in acid-free containers, but they're right next to the trunk. So they've been reunited with the trunk.
These are Nye's letters.
Nye's letters.
So some guy in 1960 took a bunch of stamps off the envelopes.
Well, no, he left them on the envelopes. He collected the envelopes, and through time, I've been able to probably acquire about 100 of them.
What's the one I gave you? That's a Beale?
No, that was John Gould's Regimental Association envelope.
Oh, okay.
Because they had
I found one, and it was on eBay.
Yeah, wow. I treasure it. It's John Gould led the Regimental Association after the war, a very viable regimental association. They met every year, and they had a cottage built on Long Island, Maine, an island just past Peaks Island.
Still there?
So, well, one of them is there. The other one was sold to the Navy after the war, and it was a Navy base. But the one that was built for the wives and some of the veterans is still there. I've been in it. As a matter of fact, the original sign saying it was for sale was there, with a woman's name and a 4-digit number. Well, that woman's father was in the regiment.
So it was just one generation, and they're already selling the place.
Well, they died. There was no reason to have reunions because there was nobody to attend.
So you've been in it?
I have.
Any remnants of?
Yes, there's a stained glass. There's a stained glass window that says First 10th 29th.
Wow.
Who owns that building now?
It's privately owned.
Okay.
It's privately owned.
They're not going to tear it down?
I hope not. They weren't sure what that stained glass meant, and I explained to them that was from the Regimental Association.
You didn't say, hey, I got a pocket knife. We can take care of this right now if you don't like it.
No.
He belongs with the buddies.
No. I'm pretty much, as you know, Jack, and you know this well, I'm a purist when it comes to
I know.
battlefields.
You'd want to keep it there unless they're tearing it down.
In case the way it was, yeah. So, and then of all the officers in the regimental historian who loved the history, wrote the history, would be the historian at every regimental reunion going over some of their escapades and battle reminiscences during the reunions. He's the last officer to die. He doesn't die until January 1st, 1930.
Wow.
Beale?
Lived a while.
Gould, yeah.
Gould. And the last member of the regiment doesn't die until the 1940s.
Wow.
But the regimental building was sold to the United States Navy because...
You were what, 18 then?
I'll remember that.
I know. I had to get it on here.
I'll remember that.
Couldn't pass up the opportunity.
Yeah, so that was a deep water port for the Navy ships. They would refuel there. As a matter of fact, some of the gas tanks are still there. There's a couple of silos that were converted into homes on the island. I actually, on my 60th birthday, I gave a lecture on the First 10th 29th Maine Association on that island.
Nice.
And all those people were wonderful, just wonderful folks over there on Long Island.
Maine are good people. Mainers are good people.
They are. You don't want to cross one.
I know. Yeah, but they're good people.
They're good people. They're very, very good people. They love their history. Some of the finest historians I know are historians from Maine.
Yeah. So I guess we kind of got, through telling all those stories, spread out all over the place. But they were in a lot of heavy fighting. Like you said, they were in 60. Nothing really much happened for them in 63. You said they were attached to Slocum at Gettysburg and did some detail there. But what else in 63 were they a part of that was pretty major?
Well, in 63, if they were in Stafford, Virginia in camps, those winter camps that are still there today, some of them, they spend their time there.
Okay.
And other than the battalion who has to stay in, they go to Chancellorsville with Slocum.
Yeah, the 10th Maine
Gettysburg.
Battalion.
But they don't reform until October.
Oh, it was the 10th Maine Infantry Regiment, not present at Gettysburg?
Not as a regiment, only as a battalion.
Battalion, okay. And then come 64, what month do they become? No, it's the fall of 63. They become the 29th Maine.
That's right.
And then they go into 64. They're attached to, it's the 19th Corps under Banks, right?
It's the 19th Corps under Banks. So they go to the Red River Campaign, and they're one of the two divisions.
When is this in 64?
Well, it's in the spring of 64.
Okay.
They don't come back down to Virginia until July and they come
basically straight to.
Yeah, because they bring two divisions.
And they're at Monocacy.
Well,
or did you just say that? Or?
They come to Monocacy. They don't fight there.
Oh, okay.
That's where they march from Monocacy to the Opequon.
And join up with Sheridan. What?
Yeah.
Are they with Sheridan from August to September 19th, or when do they fall into camp with Sheridan?
They do that in late August.
Okay. I didn't know if there were any a part of that mimic war period stuff with the Charlestown offensive and
Jefferson County.
Yeah, Jefferson County, Clark County stuff.
They spent a fair amount of time in Jefferson County when they were the 10th Maine.
Yeah.
Abiel Edwards, another great souvenir taker.
Do we have a picture? Is he one of the pictures?
You
or
do.
No?
He's the one at the end there.
What are those stripes on his arm?
He's a corporal.
So the guy with the corporal stripes. What's the guy on the left?
The fellow on the left, this is Edward Burrell.
Pull up the picture, Elijah, so I can reference it.
And
because it's all messed up over there.
And Burrell, I have in a collection.
So Burrell's the guy next to what Nick's about to talk about.
Right. This is a camp mirror.
Yeah.
And it's you wouldn't know much about it until you open it and look under the cover. And under the cover it says, Company F, 29th Maine Regiment, Sergeant E.A. Burnell, from Sister Mary, we are thinking of you at home.
So they gave that to him.
They gave that
to him. Burnell is the guy. What'd you say those stripes were on him?
He's a sergeant.
So sergeant. He's got that pocket mirror with the back. You can read what it says. Mm-hmm. To the right of that is, who's that one? You said that was Edwards?
At the end is Edwards.
Yeah. And then below him with the shoulder straps to the right and left of the picture is Beale, correct?
That's right. That's George Beale, who was the colonel and then was promoted to brigadier general.
And then the lone guy to the neck of the bottle of E.H. Taylor is Knowlton with that fancy mustache, and the one that's kind of mostly his head, that is Knowlton, the gentleman that's killed on September 19th.
That's right. That's William Knowlton.
Can you talk a little bit more about Beale and those shoulder straps?
Yes.
Yeah.
I have one of Beale's uniforms, and I have here a pair of his brigadier general shoulder straps, as well as the label from the uniform where it says Colonel Beale, 10th Maine. And
just to be clear, Nick did not remove those from the uniform.
They weren't removed from the uniform.
Yeah.
No, they weren't removed from the uniform.
Guilt-free.
They were in the trunk.
Okay. Is this the one with the Navy uniform? Same trunk?
Different trunk. As a matter of fact,
see, Nick runs into a lot of trunks.
Yeah.
Well, I've got like 6 of them. Now, there's 40 years difference between the acquisitions of the trunks. That trunk belonged to a Navy lieutenant whose brother was in the 10th Maine. And if you recall, when we were at Antietam last year, you held his brother's belt buckle. He was
Ned.
Killed. Ned, exactly.
Ned Brackett?
Ned Brackett, very good.
Buried in the officer section of the Antietam National Cemetery.
Because he was lieutenant. He was promoted to lieutenant, never received his commission. I have his commission because it came with his family papers.
And he's killed at Antietam.
He's killed Antietam. As a matter of fact, I have an article in the current Antietam Institute Journal about the belt buckle and how he received his wounds. There's some wonderful, very poignant letters written by some of the men of the regiment describing his death. And one friend comes onto the battlefield, finds Ned Brackett's body, and has a soldier fire a volley over his body.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And Brackett's belt buckle, which Nick was just talking about, which we brought back to the battlefield last year during Antietam 160. Folks, you can now see that on display at the newly renovated Antietam Visitor Center, as along with what other artifacts are on display.
It's on display with that sword that Nye received, and as well as Nye's Colt revolver that was covered in the blood
that he wiped. So that Mansfield and Lamb sword that he received, that was placed on his casket when he was buried post-war at Arlington, that you received as a gift, kind of sale, if that's also on display, you said. So
it is.
So we just talked about it. You can see it there. It's in that first display case when you walk into the visitor center to the right as you're walking into the gift shop.
That's correct.
Okay.
It's on a temporary loan.
Yeah. You can see it now as of 2023.
Yeah, it's there now. It'll be there until next year. But I was very pleased to loan it upon request of the National Park Service.
Yeah.
Because those items had such significant relevance to the Battle of Antietam. And as you know, Jack, and you know this very, very well, I really believe in sharing their history as much as I can. And I do as often as I can, because I think John Gould wanted their history shared because it was such a pivotal point in his life that he never forgot, and he was consumed by the patriotism that led him to fight and see many of his comrades die. I think this story needs to be told.
Yeah.
And there are many folks out there, many historians who also are interested in particular regiments, and they're doing a great job telling their stories, because these are stories that we can't forget.
Yeah, and you can, I think, for the public to be able to enjoy these artifacts that you've, graciously put tons of your own money into purchasing and getting, all the boys back together under one roof, and then getting them out to the public for them to see and enjoy and make that connection to that historic event and then that individual. And we talked about this in the last episode or 2 episodes ago about archaeology, but it's that tangible, but in some cases physical piece that connects, and especially with these dug relics, or now these artifacts that were put in trunks or passed down from generation to generation. It allows future generations to make that tangible connection to history and see, wow, this was a jacket that looks better than the one I'm wearing. So if you go to the Shenandoah Valley Civil War Museum, the recently renovated One Story, 1,000 Voices exhibit, Knowlton's uniform's in there. It's not the one he was wearing at the Third Battle of Winchester, but it was his uniform. His sash. What else is in there of his? Or I think that's it for him.
That's his uniform and sash.
And those, you can see that and see the blown up picture. That's the one in the episode cover behind there, and read about the premonition of death and know his connection. But then also, after you visit there, you can go and stand in the same spot where he was killed, in the middle field at 3rd Winchester, because it's now part of of an established battlefield park. So I think I'm sure it's cool for you to see these things kind of come full circle. Back in the 80s, I'm sure you couldn't have imagined, this is how it would end up, with thousands of pieces of this one regiment.
Well, that's correct. On the 150th anniversary of the Battle of 3rd Winchester, I had 16 of Knowlton's descendants here in the battlefield to recognize the 150th anniversary to the minute.
Hey, you guys are out there to the minute.
His mortal wound. They were here. But it's like you said, Jack, and you said it so well. These men are gone, but their history survives. And we have to make sure that history still survives, and we tell their stories. And their stories are told very eloquently through the artifacts, because the artifacts have their own history.
Yeah.
And when, you and I particularly, when we see young people come into our museums and visitor centers, they're captivated by it. Yeah. Just as we were when, we were children. I make it a practice when I'm at the visitor center. The first artifact I ever owned was a Civil War bullet that was found in Fredericksburg. So when I have a young person coming to the visitor center who shows a particular interest in Civil War history, and I see that there's some passion in his eyes or her eyes, I carry original silver bullets with me. I give it to them,
Nice.
and let them experience what I first did, because it's through them that the future of civil battlefield preservation is vested, and I just really enjoy seeing that. And Jack, you were one that we at the Shenandoah Battlefields Foundation early on recognized in you and your passion for civil history growing up near Star Fort, and displaying and illustrating your passion for American civil history. That's what drives us. And you were a shining example to the board and to the staff at Battlefields Foundation as you were growing up, and that's where our future lies.
Yeah, it's cool to see it now too. Like to stand on the other side of the desk per se and see those future generations coming up. These younger kids that are getting interested, because we talked about this before. But growing up, you're like, oh my god, am I like the only weirdo that likes old stuff and battlefields and stuff? And you find other people like Elijah and I, and continue to find young people that are into it.
I was at the visitor center about a month ago, and there was a family of 4 young boys from age 4 to 7, and one of them was telling me the history of Joshua Chamberlain. Another one knew history about the battle.
Yeah.
They received a
That's
package.
awesome.
They received a package in the mail from me later on.
More than just a bullet. If
Yeah.
you can stump Nick on a question, they're like, whoa.
You've earned it.
They've
You've earned it.
Remarkable young men. Four boys, and they were there with their dad, and their dad has kept in contact with me by email.
Yeah.
They want to come back to the battlefield,
Yeah.
and I told them if they came back, I'd give them a tour of the battlefield.
Yeah. No, it's moments like that and experiences like that makes this all worth it, because everyone that knows you knows that you don't do this for yourself. You don't get any, you don't go to bed at night thinking I have the most stuff or I have cool stuff. It's like, your favorite part of this, and I could be wrong, but you love sharing it and with other people. And I think that's why I love having you as a friend, because it's like, how many opportunities do I get to see cool things like this? And you're excited to show people, which is the best part. But I want to jump back to a couple other artifacts that people are going to see before this episode wraps up. The housewife, which is below a cased image you see in the episode cover. That is a housewife. It's more of a more personal item. You're not going to see or often hear historians talk about when it comes to like the equipment of a soldier, but it's very, very important to a soldier. Maybe Nick can elaborate that a little more, but it's personal at the same time, because as we've talked about a couple episodes ago, when it comes to bullets buttons and other physical things that can be found or seen, this is kind of the hidden or lost key that often people overlook. So can you tell us a little more about that housewife and who owned it?
Well, a housewife is a sewing kit, and I have about half a dozen of them.
Which is crazy.
Well, I have John Gould's. That's a leather one. I have a large leather one belonging to a captain in the 1st Maine. I also have his presentation sword. But this one's a felt one. And when you unroll it, it has the sewing needles, it has thread, it has horsehair thread as well. And it was carried in a haversack. And I was able to acquire the contents of the soldier's haversack. There's another mirror, there's Bible, his musket tools, even a piece of his tent. But one fascinating piece is a piece of cloth, light blue kersey cloth. And the note attached to it was the bullet hole from the wound I received at Cedar Creek. This was his pants.
Wow.
And he saved the bullet hole. His name was William Andrews, and he was in the 10th and 29th Maine, and acquired 2 tin types of him, one in the 10th and one in the 29th. The one in the 10th, he's wearing a breastplate, eagle breastplate, and I even have the eagle breastplate.
Wow.
And what's interesting about it is he also, and when he was in the 10th, he had the mutton chops going on, and he shaved them before he went to the 29th, so it's a different person. But I had the tin types, and he was quite a well-known veteran in Maine, where he lived. I believe it was Otisfield, and his obituary was full of his battle record, as well as a story was done on him prior to his death in a local newspaper. I think it was all half a page in the newspaper, where he recounted what he had seen and observed, and the battles he was in, as well as the comrades that were lost. So he had a very, very interesting history when he was in the 10th and 29th Maine.
Wow. And then the background picture and all the pictures, you own all of the pictures that were shown, correct? And artifacts, obviously.
Yeah, I own about 500 original images.
Yeah. So all of the pictures of people are either CDVs or other images that Nick owns in his collection. Even the background image, so we normally do like battle maps or things like that, or state maps with some of the other regimental episodes we've done. But this specific picture was taken is a Camp Sheridan, technically?
Camp Sheridan.
Yeah, and this is north of Winchester, a couple miles north of Winchester. And if you're familiar with the Winchester area, it's north of even like if you're familiar with like 2nd Winchester, the old Charlestown Road that we talked about in episode 1. This is a little bit north of that. It's where the 84 lumber yard is today.
Yeah, it's mainly where the Winchester Welcome Center is on 81.
Okay.
81 is where the camp was, I-81. And the Welcome Center sits in the middle of the camp.
And this is a picture of that camp. So winter quarter huts. This is the winter of 64 into 65. Are they ever at Camp Russell?
They are.
So they're at Camp Russell, which is south of Winchester, south of Kernstown, in between Kernstown and what at the time of the war was known as Newtown, but modern-day Stevens City. Camp Russell was spread out through that area, so they were there from...
They were there from December of 64 till the spring of 65. As a matter of fact, Nye draws pictures of his barracks.
Yeah, wow.
He sends to Charlie, and he gives her the dimensions.
Wow. And then they moved to Camp Sheridan, and this is the one north of Winchester that you see it captured by image, which is amazing. And we blew it up really big in the Shenandoah Valley Civil War Museum next to our recreated winter hut. So it's incredible. And my favorite piece of Nick's collection is one that he didn't bring up today, but this is where I can tie this in. You can see this artifact captured, and you did an episode of the Civil War Digital Digest with Will Eichler, and you could find that on the Civil War Digital Digest YouTube channel, but as well on History Fix. And History Fix, you're not a subscriber, Nick. Elijah, you're not yet, but I am. Haha. Is where you can enjoy historical stories on online, explore movies, short films, and documentaries. All the listeners so far of Battlefields and Bourbon Podcast can receive an extra 20% off of their first year's annual subscription if you sign up at www.historyfix.com and use promo code BATTLEFIELD. That's BATTLEFIELD. Battlefield. Every subscription includes a 7-day risk-free trial. So escape into history and watch some episodes of Civil War Digital Digest on History Fix. And that episode I'm talking about is with a music box that Nick owns, and this was captured by some 29th Maine guys. Taken. Go into it. I don't want to say
it wasn't captured.
Sorry.
that would have a more that would have been more unique. What happened was during the 1864 Red River Campaign in Louisiana, John Gould is in Avoyelles Parish, Louisiana, and there's a house that he sees folks removing property from the house, locals. And he was curious as to what they were taking. And he sees this wooden box. And he said he writes about in his diary, he called himself wicked, because he didn't care much for these people who were pilfering through these homes and such. But he took this music box. And as you know, Jack, because you've held it, it looks like a wooden box. You open the lid, and you see the mechanics of the box. And on the side is a secret door that has the switch to make the music sound. Well, he keeps the music box with him to the rest of the 64 Red River Campaign, and he brings it here to the Shenandoah Valley that fall. And he plays the music in the camp because you didn't have radios. They had a band that they paid for. They had a subscription to the band. They paid for that. So he would play it in his tent, the music box. He does not return the music box until April of 1865. And there's a label in the box that lists all the songs. And on top of the label, in his handwriting, he says, Avoyelles Parish, May 15th, 1864. Well, Jack, what else happened on May 15th, 1864?
The Battle of Newmarket.
The Battle of Newmarket.
But they were not there. They were in
Louisiana. in Louisiana getting souvenirs.
So that's one of my favorite pieces from Nick's collection. And you can listen to it play on an episode of Civil War Digital Digest. So you can find that on History Fix. It's one of my favorite pieces because as you're sitting there and you just listen to it, you know this is the same music that men listened to in camp either before battles or after battles, just having to sit there, and this was their only form of, escape and entertainment. And to be able to listen to the same thing is just so impactful, I think. So go over and check out that video and listen to that music box because it's incredible. Elijah, any more questions?
No, that was pretty in depth. That was a good one.
Yeah, no, I've always been excited. Nick's been teasing me about getting this together and recording it. Nick, is there anything you want to push, promote, or this is your free time to, is there any book recommendations where people can find more information about the 1st, 10th, and 29th?
Well, the John Meade Gould journals, they were published, but the publisher is no longer in business. You can find them on the secondary book market or on eBay.
Is there a title?
The Civil War Journals of John Meade Gould.
Okay, fair enough.
The Regimental History, you can get copies of that. I've got 26 copies of the original. Each one was presented to a different person by John Gould. And he usually would put some sort of annotation about his thoughts. John Gould was not someone that would hide his innermost feelings. He would express them whenever possible. Interesting, fascinating. Actually, he had a daughter who was a missionary in China and was beheaded by the Boxers during the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. He was a very, very religious man. He was in the Military Order of the Loyal Legion of the United States, which was a fraternal group of former officers. He left there because he didn't like the drinking and cigar smoking, and gave up his medal. But I would certainly encourage those out there to visit the battlefields that are owned and operated by the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation. As you know, Jack, because you're responsible for much of it, there's a great deal of interpretation. You can visit those places. You can visit the exact spot where William Knowlton was received his mortal wound. He's at the end of the defense line at the middle field. We know that because the site was recorded as being at that location by one of the other officers. Support the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation. Go to our website, shenandoahatwar.org. Become members. And it's through your membership and your interest in American Civil War history that we're able to prevail in our pursuit of our Civil War battlefields here in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. And lastly, I think it's an excellent recommendation that folks subscribe to History Fix.
Yeah.
Will does a great job with that, and Will and Andy, and I've gotten to know them, and they do wonderful work. So, and lastly, on YouTube, there's the Maine at Gettysburg channel. I've done 5 different presentations for them. The latest one is on a 10th Maine soldier who died at Cedar Mountain, and when the family got his body, it was a Confederate soldier, and they buried it in a cemetery in Gray.
So to learn more about that, go to the Maine at Gettysburg on YouTube.
Gettysburg.
That's an award-winning production, correct?
He's been nominated for Emmy Awards. He's received several awards, but it's Dan Lambert Films.
High-quality stuff,
He's an eminent professional, so see that too. But lastly, again, I just want to reiterate, become members of the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation. Go to our website, shenandoahatwar.org, and help us in our efforts to preserve, protect, and interpret our rich Civil War battlefields here in the Shenandoah Valley.
You said it perfect, Nick, and we will make sure that the Linktree link and any links we've got send people to membership of the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation. As you all know, as we say at the beginning of most of our episodes, the Battlefields Foundation is the official sponsor of the Battlefields and Bourbon Podcast, and they provide us a wonderful home here for the podcast at the preserved and historic Bell House in beautiful downtown Winchester. So as Nick said, if you want to support us, support the Battlefields Foundation, because they're keeping history alive and preserving as much as they can of it. So Nick, thank you so much for coming on. I was excited for this one ever since we started this thing back in July. So it's truly an honor to have you on, and at least for us, Elijah and I sipping on this E.H. Taylor was very good. And no complaints with it, and hopefully you enjoyed your tea, Nick.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a real joy for me to be here, and I'm really impressed what you folks are doing here with this podcast and this entire program. And I'm really pleased that the Shenandoah Battlefield Foundation is your sponsor. I think it's extremely worthwhile, and you do a lot to promote the history of American civil history. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys, and we'll catch you on the next one.